All right, well, you got through the introductory week and got to spend some time in Psalms 1 and 2, and you got to, for the first time, do your annotation. I hope that was a fun exercise for you, at least a little bit, as you're becoming familiar with some of the things that we're having you mark. This week we had two relatively short Psalms. We're starting you off easy, or you could argue that those who compiled the Psalms are starting you off easily. It will not always be thus. In fact, next week we'll have one longer Psalm and a shorter Psalm, and so you might find yourself wading through a little more text than you did this week. So I hope you enjoyed just the brevity of these, and I hope that gave you a chance to start into the reading plan and see the benefit of doing that alongside of the homework. For those of you who have done our studies before, you may have noticed that the actual questions that we were asking took a little less time than they might have in previous studies, and that is because we're leaving time for you to do the reading plan so that you can get through all of the Psalms in the 11 weeks that we have to study them. So we do have two shorter Psalms this week, and if you will remember back to our introductory teaching, we talked about those 5 questions that we ask of any book of the Bible that we read, and you should keep those in mind as you are going through any particular week. So we know roughly that the Psalms were written over a period of about 1,000 years, 4th to 5th century BC time frame, and we also know that there are multiple authors, and there are a number of Psalms that are not attributed. They don't have an author assigned to them. We don't know who wrote them, or we might have a sense of who did, but it's not actually stated in the text. And those are sometimes called the orphan Psalms. It's kind of a fun term for them, and we'll probably refer to them a little using that term as we go along. And in fact, today you could argue that we have 2 orphan Psalms, although they don't feel particularly orphaned because they're placed here right at the beginning of the Psalter. And that word Psalter just means the collection of the Psalms. It's kind of like the word hymnal. You could think of it meaning the same thing. And so it's important for us to remember why the Psalms were written at all times. Sometimes, as we've talked about, we think that they're written just for us to have a devotional experience. But what they were written for originally was for the people of God to gather and say, pray, sing the words of God back to God. You're never going to pray or sing a more effective message to the Lord than the ones that are recorded for us in the Psalms. They are the inspired words of God that instruct us in the way to address God. So you can feel a lot of safety anytime you decide to use a psalm to speak to God. So these 2 Psalms that we have here at the beginning of the Psalter, some commentators will say that they stand like 2 pillars at the entryway to this glorious book that is going to take us through the language of prayer and worship. They are similar but different, as I'm sure you saw as you were working through the homework this week. There is more of an individual focus in the first Psalm, and then more of a corporate focus in the second. But I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. When we see the man of righteousness who is given to us in Psalm 1, he is an individual in the way that he's spoken of, but he's obviously meant to be a representative individual. But the focus in the first Psalm is on a man, and in the second Psalm is on the nations or the kings who rule and set themselves in opposition to God. So a little bit of a contrast there that we see, which I think we can take from that when we're considering the Psalms as a whole, we should consider them both in how they apply to us individually in the way that we approach God, and in the way that they apply to us corporately in the way that we approach God. We're going to be looking in this study at these 9 different genres. And this week in the introductory Psalms, you had 2 different genres set next to one another. You had a wisdom psalm in Psalm 1, and then you had a royal psalm in Psalm 2. Now, obviously, in future weeks, we'll spend time looking at some of the characteristics that are particularly unique to a wisdom psalm or to a royal psalm. So we didn't spend a lot of time on that in the homework this week, but it was evident from the content of those that that's where they fall. So in a wisdom psalm, we are being pushed toward righteousness, love of the law. In a royal psalm, we are being pushed toward obedience and submission. So what we see in these 2 opening psalms that are setting the tone for us for the whole book is that we owe God both individual and corporate righteousness, and we owe God both individual and corporate submission. So it's a little bit of a setup, just an overall thing that we can see. There was also a theme that was tied between the two Psalms of blessedness, which we'll talk about as we get into the text itself. You saw those contrasts between the wicked and the righteous in both of the Psalms, presented in slightly different ways. And then what we saw in Psalm 1 is an emphasis that we are to love God's instruction. And in Psalm 2, an emphasis that we are to submit to God's rule. And those are obviously not two unrelated ideas. They're paired very nicely for us here at the beginning of the Psalms. These Psalms are not attributed. They don't have an author, and that's probably because we are meant to take them in the way that they're given to us as an introduction. In other words, don't try to pin these to a specific event or to a specific person. Just receive them as saying something generally important for you to understand as you go through the rest of the Psalms. So in the first of the 5 books of the Psalms, which you find ourselves in, these are the only 2 Psalms that we don't have any record of who it is that wrote them. They're left very general for us so that we can take them in a general form. So let's take a look at Psalm 1. We'll just, this week, because we have the luxury of not a ton of text to go through, we're going to walk through both of them and see what we can take from them. So let me just read Psalm 1 to you, and then we will pull it apart a little at a time. Psalm 1, starting in verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Now we're going to see when we get into Psalm 2 that the way of the wicked will perish. That final statement that's made here at the end of Psalm 1 is actually echoed in Psalm 2 at the end there as well. But what I wanted you to see, as I was going through this, I've spent a lot of time in the Sermon on the Mount. And so the second that I hear the word blessed, my ears kind of perk up. Because we know that Jesus knew Psalm 1. He was a good Hebrew. He had been raised in the tradition. He knew this psalm, the first one in the Psalter. And this is a psalm that begins with who is blessed, and it gives us a vision for who that is. And then it moves on in verse 2 and talks about delighting in the law and meditating on it day and night. And then it ends in verse 6 with a contrast. Actually, you could say that the whole psalm is a contrast between the way that the righteous pursue and the way that the wicked pursue. Now think about the Sermon on the Mount. It begins in chapter 5 with Jesus taking a seat on a mountaintop and uttering 8 statements about blessedness. This is who is blessed. And then it moves immediately on from that section to where Jesus says, I have not come to abolish what? The law, but to fulfill the law. And so we see a similar pattern here where we move from who it is that's blessed to we should delight in the law and meditate on it day and night. And then the Sermon on the Mount, after going through a lengthy exposition of the law, ends with a whole bunch of images, of contrasting images, 2 different kinds of trees, 2 different kinds of paths, 2 different kinds of houses, 2 different kinds of teachers, all in that last section of chapter 7, that is essentially wisdom literature contrasting the wicked and the righteous. And the final words of the Sermon on the Mount are every bit as jarring to us as the final words that we see here in Psalm 1. So Psalm 1, I would like this to end with, I would like it reversed. I would like it to say, but the way of the wicked will perish, and the Lord knows the way of the righteous. I would like it to end on a high note. That's what makes sense in my mind. That's not what Psalm 1 does for us. Psalm 2 will get us closer to that. But in the same way, in the Sermon on the Mount, I don't know if you remember this, but Jesus ends it by talking about the house that's built on the sand and the house that's built on the rock, and basically says, hey, the house on the sand just gets obliterated. And then he's like, bye, guys. So what should we take from this? Well, we need to understand that wisdom literature doesn't always lend itself to our preferences. In fact, I would say that it rarely does, unless you're someone who just happens to be wise out of the gate. Wisdom literature is meant both to exhort and to reprove. It does those two things for us. But wisdom literature is also pointing us toward the one who is eminently wise, as we will see. So let's take a look at some of the mechanics of this and just see what we can pull from it. So you saw in your homework that it was divided into different sections. And in the first section, we get the contrast between the man who is righteous and the man who is unrighteous in where they walk and where they stand and where they sit. So a good exercise that you can do when you're kind of wanting to enter into the text is if it says this is what the wicked does, you can turn it on its head and say, well, if that's what the wicked does, then what does the righteous do conversely? So I'll just give you an example. So we have, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. So that's what he does not do. He does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. So then we would be able to imply that he does walk in the counsel of who? The righteous. He surrounds himself with those who are righteous. Also, this man is blessed when he does not stand in the way of sinners. So we would expect that the blessed man is the one who stands in the way of those who obey God's law. Blessed is the man who does not sit in the seat of scoffers. So we would understand then that the blessed man is one who sits in the seat of those who speak life and truth and godliness. So we have walk, stand, and sit. And some interpreters will tell you that they see a progression there, that there is a continuous movement toward being stayed in their behaviors, in their unrighteous behaviors. That it's one thing to be someone who walks in the counsel of the wicked, but if you're standing in the way of the sinners, then you're entering into a more permanent relationship. And if you're sitting in the seat of scoffers, then you are really just kind of taking your seat and making your home there. That may be a valid way to read this. I think at the very least, we can look at it as a repetition that is layering this idea on top of itself for us. But it's interesting to me because I think that counsel of the wicked and way of the sinners, those feel like pretty similar statements to me, but then seat of the scoffers kind of hits you a little sideways. Like, how is that an analogous statement to the two statements that came before? Well, on the one hand, it could be an expansive idea. But you could also argue that what it is the outward manifestation of what it is in your heart to be in the way of the sinner or the counsel of the wicked. In other words, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And when we are in the congregation of the unrighteous, the end result will be that we are not those who extol God, but instead scoff. We live in a day and age where scoffing is everywhere all around us. This is an admonition to us to watch that our speech is a match for our hearts. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So we're getting this picture of blessedness, and it's important for us to understand that what we think means blessed is not what the Bible means when it says blessed. We think that blessed means happy or content. But blessedness means that the benediction of God rests upon you. Mortimer Adler says in his book, 10 Philosophical Mistakes, people generally espouse the mistake made by most modern philosophers that happiness is a psychological state rather than an ethical state. In other words, the quality of a morally good life. So when the Bible says blessed, it doesn't mean that you feel a certain way. It means that you behave, you're in your essence, you are a certain way. The blessed person is a moral person. It is a person who is ethical. It is a person who walks in the way of the righteous. Okay, so it says that person delights in the law of the Lord, and on it he meditates day and night. So we asked you in your homework to look up those terms, delight and meditate. Delight, I hope you saw, is pretty simple. It meant enjoyment, takes enjoyment in, takes pleasure in. And then this term meditate, I hope you were paying attention to the way that the dictionary defined this. I looked it up in a couple of different places just to make sure that I was seeing the same theme. On it he meditates day and night. These are the definitions I found. To meditate is to, and I'm going to emphasize, think deeply or focus one's mind for a period of time, to give serious and careful thought to. So did you hear that? Think deeply, focus mind, give careful thought to. When you and I think about what it means to meditate on the law of God, we sometimes think that it means that we're supposed to just sit and repeat it over and over again until it makes sense, or we're supposed to sit and wait for some thought to coalesce in our heads. We have all kinds of ideas about what meditation means that are more mystical than they are mental. But this definition for meditate is showing us that this is a person who thinks on these things, to borrow from another passage. Whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, virtuous, of good report. Think on these things. Meditate on these things. But meditation is an exercise of the mind. And so when we read in a wisdom psalm that we are to meditate on the law day and night, what we're being called to is not a mystical practice, but a mental practice, that you would weigh it and consider it and think about it and try to make logical connections to your own life between what the law commands and who God says that he is, and how those two things work together to make you as someone who walks in the way of the righteous. So then we have this extended metaphor. The righteous is like a tree. He's planted by streams of water. It yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. By contrast, what are the wicked like? They're like chaff, and you looked that word up. That's that little husk that's on the grain that just blows away in the winnowing process. So this thing that is rooted and steadfast and firm compared to this thing that is unrooted and is in fact dead. I mean, at the point that there's chaff on the grain, it means that the plant is dying. So life, death, rootedness and stability, instability and lack of roots put in contrast to one another. Now, in your homework, you got to look at Genesis 1 and see the image of the tree in the garden there. In Genesis 2. And then you also went all the way to Revelation and saw the image of the tree in the garden there. So here, the righteous man is being compared to these Eden images and these new heavens and new earth images. So we're meant to understand that when we walk in the way of the righteous, we become citizens of the kingdom of heaven in evident ways. In ways that say, let it be as it was. Let it be as it will be once again. As far as I am able, I will live in that way. So then in verse 5, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So catch what's happening here, because that stand should have made your ears perk up, because we already saw stand up in verse 1. So it's saying that even though they may have stood in the way of sinners, or walked in the counsel of the wicked, or sat in the seat of scoffers, in the day of judgment, you know what they won't do? They will not stand. So looking forward, it may look right now like the wicked are flourishing, but it will come to pass that they will not stand. The wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So the congregation of the righteous is set in contrast to the counsel of the wicked. There are rooms where the wicked take counsel among one another, and then there are rooms where the righteous take congregation together to draw strength and assurance and courage from one another. Verse 6, for the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So we are left in no doubt about the end of the path of the wicked, and we are also left in no doubt about the end of the path of the righteous. Very quickly, before we move on to Psalm 2, I just want to point out to you some of the things that I wrote, attributes that I saw of God in here, and you can compare them to some of the attributes that maybe you noted. I think this is a psalm that is establishing for us that God is just because he deals justly with the unrighteous and the righteous. That God is holy because he gives his holy law and he holds us to it. That he is wise. You can't look at a wisdom psalm and not miss that all wisdom comes from God. And also that he is righteous. So don't miss this. The way of the righteous is God's way. The congregation of the righteous is God's congregation. They are righteous because he makes them so. He decrees that they will be so. Look at Psalm 1, verse 2. Just look back at it again. We had you paraphrase it this week. I want you to write something in your notes, and then I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise, okay? I want you to write this. But his delight is in blank. And on blank, he meditates day and night. So just write that in your notes. But his delight is in blank, and on blank, he meditates day and night. Got it? Okay, so we talked at the beginning about how a good exercise is to take what is said about either the wicked or the righteous and then turn it on its head to see what else it might be teaching us. So now I want to ask you, if the righteous delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on it day and night, now think about your own behavior. Think about yourself in this moment. What is it that you are delighting in? What are you taking joy from? What are you meditating on? What are you giving your thoughts to day and night? Is it the news cycle? Is it what's going on in social media? Is it Netflix? Is it your financial concerns? Think about all of the other ways that we can fill in this blank in a way that would place us in the category of the unwise instead of in the category of the wise. Then I want you to think about the law of the Lord. Now, we'll get to spend a whole week on Psalm 119, so I'm not going to take away from that. But do you enjoy your time in the scriptures? Does it delight you? Is it something that consumes your thinking, that you dedicate a lot of mental effort to, not just emotional effort to, but mental effort to, so that right thinking can fuel right feeling? Nathan Campbell, my colleague, says this. He says it this way. He told me this week. I thought it was so good. He says, your default is your delight. The thing that you default to is what is revealing what you really love. So whatever your default answer would be to filling in that blank, ask yourself, why do I delight in that instead of in the law of the Lord? Why do I delight in this other thing instead of that which is illustrating for me who God is and what pleases him? So we start with a wisdom psalm, which should perk up our ears that the Psalms as a whole are going to be concerned with showing us the difference between the way of the wise and the way of the unwise, the way of the righteous and the way of the unrighteous. But we're not just left with that. We have two pillars that we walk through. So now let's look at Psalm 2 and see what we can pull from it. If the summary statement for Psalm 1 is walk in the way of the righteous, actually, that's what I started with. You know how we have you summarize it into one sentence? I started with just, hey, walk in the way of the righteous. And then I went back and I edited it a little bit to say, walk in the abundant way of the righteous. Because the way that is being given to us is not just a way of getting by. It is the abundant place to be. That tree that's planted by streams of living water is yielding fruit. You may remember in the New Testament, Jesus curses a fig tree that doesn't yield fruit in season. That's a really weird thing. If you're just in the New Testament, you see him cursing this tree. But I think he's also thinking about these images in the Old Testament, that the one who is truly planted with deep roots will produce fruit. And what that tree in its fruitlessness is showing in a parable form is that there is no righteousness there. Of course, we know that tree represents the nation of Israel from other places in the scriptures. But what Jesus is saying then is, hey, you are giving the appearance of having your roots tapped into the one true God, but nothing about you is demonstrating that that is true. So we want to be those who, as the children of God, walk in the way of righteousness, sit in the path and the counsel of those who love the Lord, and who have on our lips words of blessing, and who have words of praise for God on our lips at all times. I'll circle back to that in just a minute, but let's get through Psalm 2. So in Psalm 2, my summary statement there would be, submit to God's rule and to his chosen king. I don't know what yours was. There's not a right answer. There are probably answers that are better than others, but something to capture the kingly nature of this royal psalm. So let's read it. Starting in verse 1, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. So we have a narrator who is asking a question, and he's saying, why are the nations raging? Why are they saying we're going to set ourselves in opposition to God? And then that narrator says something else. He says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. And you can see here a contrast to the scoffers that we had in Psalm 1. God is laughing at these foolish words of the scoffers who scoff at God. Verse 5, then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So the narrator is now telling us that Yahweh has a king who is going to conquer all those other kings. Verse 7, the narrator says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So now we find out that the speaker is that one who is anointed to be king. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. Now, if you were paying attention this week, you may have felt the stress right here in the middle of this psalm. And I pointed it out to you in the homework that you should look for that middle point of stress. So verse 7 forms sort of the middle stress piece of the psalm, but it's followed up immediately with verse 8, ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. When you got to that, I hope you thought of Genesis chapter 12 and God's promise to Abraham that through him and his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, a messianic promise that was pointing to Christ. In fact, if you look up and you see the subtitle for this psalm, the reign of the Lord's anointed, that word anointed is Messiah, the reign of the Lord's Messiah. So a royal psalm, as all the royal psalms will be, is ultimately a messianic psalm, pointing us to something that is true about Jesus. Now, in its immediate context, it would have likely been applied to David, King David. So, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And then verse 8, ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. So we have this picture of Yahweh saying to the chosen anointed son, hey, I will give to you all the nations of the earth. Through you they will be blessed. Verse 9, he says, you shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And we took you to Revelation 19 to connect this image of Jesus, the rider on the white horse with the sword that comes out of his mouth, the rod of iron. Verse 10, now therefore, and we always pay attention to therefores, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. So who is giving this warning? Well, it's the one who is narrating. It is the Son. He says, now therefore, O kings, be wise. So the king who is the Son is now speaking to other earthly kings. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Okay, so if we can get to the end of verse 12, we get to end on a high note. But there's a lot of shattering and dashing and trembling and fear. And I don't know about you, but I would prefer that my messianic psalms not include those elements. I would rather they say things like, come unto me all you who are weary and heavy laden. And certainly Jesus, the one who fulfills this prophecy, does say those things. But why here do we have these other images? Well, at the time that this psalm is written, the nation of Israel is in very real conflict with other nations and kings who are warring against the people of God, who are Yahweh's representatives. So for them, this is a very present reality. And you and I are warring against sin. We are warring against that enemy of our souls that wants to make war against anything that is righteous. So there's always a good word of warning for us to take to heart when we see anything about God's judgment. We can be admonished to walk in the way of the righteous so that we are not found guilty of the same sins that would be committed by those who do not know the Lord and do not worship him as King. Now, right here we see, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. So the narrator, who is the Son, is saying, you know what you should do? You should kiss me so that you will not perish in the way. And that's a reference back to Psalm 1, the way of the wicked will perish. What kind of a kiss is being talked about here? Well, if he's a king, then it's probably not the kiss that we would typically think of, like a friendly greeting kiss or a kiss that shows that someone is family. This is someone coming and kissing the hand of a sovereign. It's someone showing submission to a rightful ruler. So it's not a kiss of familiarity or friendship. It is a kiss of submission. It's saying, I am in charge and you report to me. And so those who submit to God will not perish in the way. They will be brought into the way of the righteous. Those who do not submit to God will be broken to pieces like a potter's vessel. So when we look at verse 11, just pop your eyes back up there, and it says, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Who is being admonished there? Who serves the Lord? The righteous serve the Lord. And yet here we see that we're to serve him with fear, and that we're even to combine our rejoicing with trembling. Now, this is one of those moments where we might want to say, okay, well, that's the Old Testament, and that's kind of the way that things went, but now we have Jesus, and he's the true and better mediator, so we don't have to be that way anymore, because perfect love casts out fear. Like if I had a nickel for every time I've talked about the fear of the Lord and someone has come to me and said, no, you don't understand. Perfect love casts out fear. So that's something that's over and done because of the cross. And yet, if you go to Hebrews chapter 12, where we're in the New Testament, and the author of Hebrews is actually making the point that the new covenant is a better covenant, and points to Mount Sinai and says, remember Mount Sinai and the thunder and the lightning and how the people were scared to even touch the mountain because they knew if they did that they would die? And then he says, that's not the mountain you came to. You've come to Mount Zion and to rejoicing in angels in festal celebration. That's the mountain that you've come to. And to Jesus, who's the mediator of a new covenant. And so then we would expect, oh, great, since that's the case, then there's no more fear and trembling. But what does the author of Hebrews say next? He says that we should then worship the Lord in reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. He does not remove for us this sense that God is worthy of even our trembling. Now, we do not tremble as those who will not stand in the judgment. We tremble as those who will be able to stand in the judgment. Why? Because this king who's spoken of in Psalm 2 is also who's spoken of in Psalm 1. Jesus Christ is Blessed One. He is the one who walks in the way of the righteous. He is the one who stands in the way of those who please the Lord. He is the one who takes his seat on a mountaintop and speaks words of life instead of scoffing at God on high. And because Jesus Christ delighted in the law of the Lord and meditated on it day and night, and then went to a tree to restore us to God, we will stand in the day of judgment. We will stand in the day of judgment, but we will still offer the kiss of submission. God will always reign and rule. We will always be his subjects. And he is due our reverence and our awe, even as we find acceptance in him through the finished work of Christ. So what are some of the attributes of God that we see in this psalm? We see that God is wrathful. Like there are some things in here that make us uncomfortable. We see that he is a jealous God. And the jealousy of God is so important to understand as the natural expression of the love of God. So when you love something deeply and truly, it is natural that when that thing suffers harm or violence or is sinned against, that you would feel jealousy on its behalf. Human jealousy is a very muddled and difficult thing because it's usually self-serving and it's wounded in a way that does not model righteousness. But the jealousy of God is always a justified jealousy because he is a worthy object of all of our worship. We see the sovereignty of God, and we see the transcendence of God. He is not just a little above us as a human ruler would be. We can't say, oh yeah, he's a ruler, but I could put myself in his place. None of us will ever ascend to the place of God. He transcends. So we see this sort of terrifying picture of a God who is jealous and wrathful, who punishes the wicked for their opposition to him, but who invites us to come and submit to him. And then look at this final verse. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. We are able to take refuge in him because Jesus Christ walked in the way of the righteous. We're able to take refuge in him because God's anointed loved God's law. We are able to take refuge in him from our enemies of sin from the enemy of death. But don't miss this. We are also able to take refuge in him, from him. Jesus Christ bears the wrath of God that was intended for us. He takes on the wrath of God so that we don't have to. God saves us from his own wrath in Christ, and we are able to take refuge in him. Because he is a place of refuge for us, we can know that his words will be a source of refuge for us, and that this book of the Psalms will be a source of refuge for us. Now, it will be a source of refuge to us in the Psalms that offer us comfort, but it will also be a source of refuge to us in the Psalms that challenge us to submit. Because refuge and safety are found in a complete and right understanding of how God relates to his people because of who God is. So Psalm 1 and 2 are inviting us through the entryway. They're saying, take a step into the room. And as you do so, keep in mind that the way of the righteous is the way that you will be led in, and that the path of submission is the path to refuge. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this entry point to this book of 150 carefully gathered, carefully worded words of God to be returned to God. We pray, Lord, that you would teach us to be like Christ, to set aside the way of the wicked for the way of the righteous. We thank you that that narrow way has been opened to us through that small gate that is Jesus Christ himself. Help us to step forward in it, in the knowledge that you guard our steps, that you are a consuming fire, but you also invite your people to draw near through Christ. Lord, help us to draw near to you through the Psalms this semester, whether they make us feel warm or whether they make us feel a little off balance. Help us to meditate on them, to apply our thoughts, to think on them once and then to think on them again and to think on them again and to think on them again. And to ask your Spirit to breathe through them in a way that is profitable, that teaches us, that corrects us, that rebukes us, that comforts us, that exhorts us, and that shows us how to walk in the way of life. And we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.